Hi, and welcome to this video. This is Joby, and in this one I wanted to talk about, for like a really brief time, why Ghors are not so good and why you should always prioritize wearing a legendary pair of gloves. I know it's common knowledge now that Ghors are not very good, and they're actually very bad in their current state, but I just wanted to give a bit more details on why that is. So, first things first, we need to compare both items, like a unique pair of gloves, a unique pair of Ghors, and then a legendary pair of gloves. And starting off with the modifiers, where like the main difference lies, is that Ghors pretty much come with only one really good stat, which is the 4 ranks to Whirlwind. And then all the rest is pretty much either average or very bad. The attack speed is pretty much like useless because it does not scale whirlwind damage as far as I'm concerned. The lucky hit chance is okay. And then the non-physical one is modifier is also pretty much, okay-ish to a certain extent because the explosion is fire coming from Ghors, and I'll get into that in a bit. When you take that and compare it to a legendary pair of gloves where you can of course find the 4 ranks of Whirlwind, that's the same thing, but then you have your crit chance, which is very important, specifically in the late game when you start stacking a lot of crit damage, and then you have a good chunk of strength. I think it's up to 63, which is not negligible, and then maybe either a good chunk of dexterity to fulfill those Paragon boards like nodes requirements, or the crit chance against injured if you want to go for something like Uber Lilith or something like that. So right off the bat, you can easily see that in terms of modifiers, a legendary pair of gloves is way better than Ghors. And also on top of that, you can add an aspect of your choice. And for example, the one that I'm using now is the one that gives you the opportunity to stack with your basic skill up to 30% more damage on your core skill, and then snapshot that on your whirlwind and pretty much have like a bonus 30% on top of everything else on your whirlwind, which is pretty substantial. So if you want to just take those like face value at their face values and then compare them, you can see clearly that the in terms of modifiers, it's not even close. You're gaining so much from a legendary pair of gloves, almost around 50% more damage. However, the Ghors are unique, so the unique aspect of them should normally, be better than those 50% more damage. But the issue is it's not the case. On single target, it's pretty much not even close, because when you take a look at the unique aspect of Ghors, it says Whirlwind explodes after it ends, dealing, let's assume, 26% of the total base damage dealt to surrounding enemies as fire damage. Two very important things here. It says of total base damage. So to my knowledge, and I asked around regarding this, and I'm pretty sure that it's accurate, Ghor explosion only takes into account when stacking the damage, the base damage of your whirlwind. So basically, if you hit a vulnerable enemy or your crit or whatever, those like values are not taken into account, and only the base damage is taken into account. And then when the explosion from Ghors happens and hits, that's at that point, that's when the modifiers or the damage buckets start scaling, apply to your Ghor hit damage. So if you crit or you hit a vulnerable enemy, it doesn't really, affect how much damage you actually stack, which is a very bad thing in my opinion, because you're pretty much relying on when the explosion happens, it needs to crit and hit a vulnerable enemy. Otherwise, it's doing shit damage. And then just the mechanic of basically, charging up all pretty much your damage in one single hit, and then depending on that hit, if it crits or not, it makes or break like your DPS gain from that item is pretty bad. The second thing is that the explosion is fire damage. So basically, like I said, the explosion happens and then the hit is calculated and then the damage scalars from your stats are applied. Well, it doesn't take into account the damage with physical stat, which in my case is at around 178%, which is pretty substantial. And that by itself is around 20 to 24% of my total damage. So you see clearly that on single target, the 26% that I'm gaining from Ghors, I'm pretty much losing it anyway beforehand since the explosion is fire. So hopefully that explains to you why on single target Ghors are pretty much just like a dead item, because it doesn't provide anything. It actually doesn't provide anything because the explosion, like I said, you gain as much damage as you lose in the first place. So yeah, that's it. Now, in terms of AoE, and there's an argument that could be made in terms of AoE, why Ghors could be all right, is basically if you happen to be in a situation where you have like an elite or two, and then have a bunch of mobs around them and stack your Ghor explosion like twice, 3 times, 4 times, even let's say 10 times faster, and then explode on their elites and pretty much one-shot them if you happen to, manage the whenever you stop whirlwinding, so the elites are vulnerable and then crit on those hits, you can pretty much one-shot those elites, and that feels good. However, that happens not very frequently in my experience. And it's very, very inconsistent by nature. And then also sometimes when I stop whirlwinding, it does not work for some reason. And with the recent hotfix that Blizzard implemented regarding the fact that like your shouts do not interrupt your whirlwind now, the only way for you to actually explode or, proc Ghors is to stop whirlwinding, and then that gameplay becomes a bit clunky because you now are losing your snapshots in terms of damage, etc., etc. So it doesn't feel like really good because yes, you're gaining that and proccing Ghors, but at the same time, you're losing out on those damage buffs that you snapshotted earlier. So if you do not crit and one-shot the elite, you find yourself pretty much, starting from the beginning, and then restacking those buffs and then whirlwinding again to try to kill the elites again. So it's, in my opinion, it's a very, very not enjoyable way of playing. I like the fact that the shouts beforehand, stopped or were a way to proc Ghors. But I know that in that regard, that could be nice, but in other regards, it's kind of like doesn't work with your flow since you're also losing your snapshots, etc., etc. So anyway, what I'm trying to say here is that even on AoE, specifically since we are running Nightmare Dungeons like randomly, we can't really specifically like target one Nightmare Dungeon and start running that like multiple times in a row. You can't really be certain to have that density, to have that setup of elites between other mobs and taking advantage of that to one-shot those elites. And then you find yourself at the boss not having as much damage as you would be with a regular pair of gloves. But you can also say that you can, swap that one and have it in your inventory, blah, blah, blah. But again, I feel like that's very inconsistent. That's a very clunky way and not fun way of playing the game, in my opinion. So even in AoE, I would say Ghors are not the best, right? I mean, they could be way, way better when they were at 100%. That was pretty broken because you basically are doing like twice, 3, 4 times the damage. And if you have like the right setup, you can multiply your damage by 10 sometimes if you have the right setup. But again, I hope they kind of take a look at this and see how those unique gloves are not very unique at the end. I mean, the mechanic is kind of unique, but in terms of usability, they fall short. So hopefully with the season 1 tuning, they they kind of find a way to balance this and make them a bit more interesting. And before I let you go, I just wanted to show you something, which is basically my calculation when it comes to Ghors on single target, and for you to see like the amount of substantial damage loss that you are actually, facing if you equip them. So this is my way of calculating my damage. It's pretty straightforward, basic, but correct way to do it. I've been using this for the couple, since the game released. So this is my damage with Ghors on single target. It's 1,965k. This is my DPS. And then this is with the legendary pair of gloves that only has the 12% crit and 60 strength. 2,676, which is basically around, I would say, 20 to 30% more damage, maybe more. And then 12% crit plus 60 strength plus 60 dexterity, which is not a substantial gain because it only gives us around 1% crit chance. And then a perfect rolled one with the expecting, like for my example, the expected aspect, it's pretty much like you see 50% more damage